This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and today is Monday. That means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to take a look at Time Walk effects. In Magic, a Time Walk effect is one that gives you an extra turn. We get the nickname for this effect from a card in Alpha, which is of course part of the Power 9, and easily one of the most powerful cards in the entire game. Taking an extra turn is simply one of the most powerful things you can do in Magic. The very nature of the effect basically amounts to allowing you to do a whole bunch more stuff while not letting your opponent do anything. Because this kind of effect is so strong, Wizards of the Coast doesn't print Time Walk effects all that often, and when they do, they're generally way more expensive than the 2 mana that the original Time Walk costs. This is actually the second time I've taken a look at Time Walk effects. The original top 10 on Time Walks came out in February of 2019, in the 150th episode of this series, so it's been a really long time. That's why it seemed like a good time to do an update, as the list has changed significantly. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. As I usually do in an MTG top 10 that updates an old one, I'm going to start by talking about the cards that made the list last time, but didn't make it this time. This time around, there's 4 of those, starting with Karn's Temporal Sundering, which was at number 10 last time. This 6-mana legendary sorcery is, of course, a Time Walk effect, but it also lets you bounce a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Actually impacting the board and getting an extra turn can be a powerful thing, but the fact this is a legendary sorcery makes it kind of hard to cast because you simply can't cast it at all if you don't control a legendary creature or planeswalker. That's some significant setup, and it means that this can end up being a dead card in your hand pretty often. This prevented it from seeing a ton of play in Standard, though it did find some success in Turbo Fog decks. It has even gained 1 point since last time, but it took 12 points to make the list this time around, so it wasn't nearly enough. Next, there's Seed Time, which was at number 8 last time. You can already see this one's pretty unique because it's green. This 2-mana instant can only be played during your turn, and it only actually does something if your opponent has cast a blue spell during your turn. So, obviously, this is an incredibly narrow Time Walk that is meant to hose blue decks, especially blue decks who like to do annoying stuff during your turn, like countering your spells. It gained all of its points in extended sideboards, but hasn't gained points anywhere since 2007. It's very unlikely to ever find its way back on the list. Next, there's Temporal Mastery, which was at number 6 last time. This Time Walk costs a whopping 7 mana, but it also comes with the Miracle mechanic. This means that if it's the first card you draw in your turn, you can reveal it and cast it for an alternate cost, which in this case is 1 generic and a blue. In other words, it pretty much becomes the original Time Walk when you can Miracle it. It was played in a Theros block constructed deck that was all about miracles, and it was also played in Modern Taking Turns, which, as the name implies, was all about chaining Time Walk effects together. It has gained 1 point since 2019, but it wasn't enough to reach the 12-point threshold that was required this time. Lastly, there's Final Fortune, which was at number 4 last time. Like Seed Time, this Time Walk is fairly unique because it isn't blue at all. For 2 red mana, this gives you an extra turn, but it comes with a pretty big downside. You lose the game at the end of that turn. In other words, it is all or nothing. You better win the game with that extra turn, or that's it. It was largely used in red aggro decks as a way to close out games, since it could allow you to do back-to-back alpha strikes to finish off your opponent. It hasn't gained any points since 2005, so it's no surprise it couldn't hang on to a spot on the list. Alright, now that we've looked at the cards from last time that didn't make it this time, let's move to the list proper, starting with the number 10 card, which is Alchemist Gambit, which didn't even exist back in 2019. It has a similar design to Final Fortune. It costs 1 more mana, but it gives you an extra turn, and you lose the game at the end of that extra turn. It also makes it so damage can't be prevented, but what makes Alchemist Gambit significantly better is the alternate casting cost. Cleave allows you to pay 4 generic and 2 blue and a red to erase the part of the card that makes you lose the game, turning it into a time walk effect with no downside. It was played in standard control decks that ran it alongside Galvanic Iteration and a bunch of treasure, so the deck was very capable of generating a ton of extra turns and winning as a result. It's also played in Pioneer Lotus Field decks. These decks specialize in untapping Lotus Field several times and making a lot of mana, and obviously you can get the Cleaved Gambit going pretty easily in a deck like that. It's a combo deck too, so sometimes you really do just need that extra turn to win, and you don't even have to cleave it. It is still gaining points in 2023, so it has a reasonable shot at holding on to a spot on this list. At number 9, it is Teferi, Master of Time, another newcomer to the list that didn't exist back in 2019. He's a 4-mana planeswalker that starts with 3 loyalty. He comes with the ability to use loyalty abilities on any player's turn and anytime you could play an instant. This not only means you can do stuff like phase things out with his -3 at instant speed, it also means that you can use his loyalty abilities twice as often, since you can do it during your turn and then again during your opponent's turn. He finds his way onto the list by way of his ultimate, a -10 that gives you 2 extra turns. Because he can use his +1 twice per each turn cycle, he can actually get to that 10 loyalty surprisingly quickly. He was played in control decks in standard, as well as in cycling decks that look to draw and discard a bunch of cards. He hasn't gained any points since rotating out of standard though, and that doesn't look likely to change anytime soon. At number 8, it is Part the Waterveil, which has moved up 1 spot since 2019. This is another time walk that can actually add something significant to the board. You can simply cast this as a 6-mana time walk that exiles itself, but you can also go for the alternate awakening cost of 6 generic and 3 blue, which makes one of your lands into a 6/6 creature with haste. That's an impressive body to add to the board, and if you can swing with it and get in the turn you animate it, that means you're going to hit them again during that extra turn. It didn't do a ton in standard, 9 mana was asking a whole lot, though it did pick up 1 point in the format in a Simic ramp deck. In Modern, it's been played in walks decks, which I mentioned earlier. These are decks built entirely around chaining together time walks, and one of the main ways the deck wants to win the game is to animate lands with Part the Waterveil. It has been the most successful in the time since the last list in Pioneer, where it was played in Omnath Ramp, a 5-color deck that uses Omnath Locus of Creation alongside a whole bunch of ramp to gain insane advantages, and one of the things the deck can ramp into is an awakened Part the Waterveil. It hasn't gained any points since 2021 though. It'll be interesting to see if it can maintain a spot on this list. At number 7, it is Time Warp, which was in the same slot last time. Certainly the simplest Time Walk we've seen so far. This has the same effect as the original Time Walk, but it costs 3 more mana. And it's still really good. That goes a long way towards showing how busted an extra turn for 2 mana is. It found some limited success in Extended, but has gone on to some more consistent performances in Modern, where it's been played in that Taking Turns deck. It's also found its way into Yorion decks in the format, especially because the deck is good at blinking Eternal Witness over and over again, and if you can keep getting Time Warp back with that, it gets pretty silly. While Yorion did recently get banned, it has started to see play in Modern Bring to Light, which can tutor it up when the situation calls for an extra turn. Time Warp has also been really successful in Historic, where it helped power the Jeskai Turns deck, which looked to use Velomachus Lorehold's attack trigger to hit Time Warps, allowing you to chain together a bunch of extra turns. Time Warp is likely to gain more points in Modern in the future. At number 6, it is Nexus of Fate, which has fallen a single slot since 2019. This 7-mana instant gives you an extra turn, and it gets shuffled back into your library anytime it goes into your graveyard from anywhere. While 7 mana is a lot for an extra turn that doesn't do anything else directly, the fact the Nexus goes back into your library is a big deal. This is because it gives you the very real possibility of allowing you to take turn after turn when you cast a Nexus, especially if you have 4 of them in your library. There's a reason most other recent Time Walk effects get exiled when they resolve, and this is it. In Standard, producing the mana for it was a lot easier to do than you'd think because of Wilderness Reclamation, and as a result there were standard Turbo Fog decks built around winning the game by taking a bunch of extra turns. Reclamation ended up getting banned to weaken that type of deck. Since then, the Nexus has only been played in Modern, where it's sometimes used as something to ramp into, but it's also used in landless spy decks, which look to mill themselves out and generate a ton of value from the graveyard. But there's a problem. That deck usually needs another turn to win the game, so in that deck, the Nexus is mostly just used to keep the spy player from decking themselves, so they have that extra turn to win. The Nexus is going to keep gaining points in Modern. At number 5, it is Temporal Trespass, which didn't make the list last time. While it existed, it had exactly 0 points in 2019, so all 52 points it has have come over the last few years. This Time Walk costs 11 mana, but it does have Delve. This means you can reduce the cost by 1 generic for every card you exile from your graveyard when you cast it. It has gained almost all of its points in Pioneer in either Lotus Field or Izzet Phoenix decks. Lotus Field decks can produce the mana to cast this more easily, while Izzet Phoenix decks are all about casting tons of cheap spells and rapidly loading the graveyard, making casting this for a reduced cost much easier. It's also gained a couple of points in modern Izzet control decks. Trespass is likely to keep gaining points. At number 4, it is Alrund's Epiphany, which didn't exist back in 2019. This 7-mana Time Walk also makes you 2 1/1 bird creature tokens. It also happens to come with Foretell, which means you can exile it from your hand for 2 generic mana, and then later you can pay its Foretell cost to cast it. In this case, 4 generic and 2 blue. In other words, if you have the time and mana to foretell this earlier in the game, you end up getting to cast it a full turn earlier. Adding 2 bodies to the board in addition to getting that extra turn is huge, as those birds can also become your win condition. The Epiphany was an absolute powerhouse while it was in Standard, where it was very heavily played, making an appearance in virtually any control deck. It has had some more limited success in Pioneer, where it's been played in Lotus Field and Izzet control decks. It's likely to gain more points in Pioneer going forward, but it has slowed down significantly since rotating out of Standard, so it isn't all that likely to gain a ton of points in the future. At number 3, it is Emrakul the Eon's Torn, which actually fell 1 spot since the 2017 list. This 15-mana creature has a reasonable claim as the most powerful creature in all of Magic. She can't be countered, she's a 15/15, and importantly for this list, she lets you take an extra turn if you cast her. She also comes with flying, protection from colored spells, and Annihilator 6. If you can cast her, it's pretty impossible for you to lose the game, but even if you don't get that Time Walk part of the card, just cheating her into play and attacking with her once often does the job, as if you do it early enough, they have to sacrifice pretty much all of their permanents and take 15. So while Emrakul is occasionally cast by some decks, most of the time people just try to cheat it into play using various methods like Through the Breach, Oath of Druid, Sneak Attack, Indomitable Creativity, and Show and Tell. She's going to keep gaining points in multiple formats, but it's virtually impossible that she ever catches the top 2 cards on this list because they have a big lead. At number 2, it's Time Vault, which has moved up 1 spot since 2019. It actually should have been number 2 back then, but in 2019 I wasn't doing a very good job yet of giving Eternal formats enough credit in this series, since they didn't have very many Pro Tours and Grand Prix, and that was pretty much all I counted at the time. I have since made it so more formats result in points, which has allowed Legacy and Vintage cards to be better represented on the list. Anyway, Time Vault is a 2-mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped, and it doesn't untap during your untap step. The only way to untap it is by skipping your turn. Then, once it's untapped, you can tap it to take an extra turn. Obviously, giving up a turn to get one back isn't the best thing ever, but Time Vault is incredibly easy to combo with. As long as you combine it with any repeatable untap effect, you get to take infinite turns. As a result, it's banned everywhere but Vintage, where only a single copy is legal. That single copy is played in many decks, as tutoring it up and using it alongside Manifold or Voltaic Key simply wins you the game. It's going to keep seeing incredibly heavy play in Vintage going forward, and will pretty much always be the number 2 card on this list, since the number 1 card on the list is even more heavily played in Vintage, and that card is, of course, Time Walk. We don't really need to say much about this card. It's simply one of the most broken cards in the history of the game, something that I think is made even more clear by all the much worse Time Walk effects we've looked at in this video that are still really powerful. Like Time Vault, it's banned everywhere except Vintage, where it's restricted. It's played in almost all Vintage decks, and, well, that's about all there is to it. So those are the top 10 Time Walk effects in Magic. If you're interested in taking some extra turns, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and hit that like button. If you want to catch up on the over 600 other MTG top 10s, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.